Dreamland Theatre in Edmonton, Alberta. A shabby little building out to make a buck. They worked hard in the Dreamland, but they didn't have too much to show for it at the end of the day. The afternoon of July 21st, 1896. 1,000 seats have been set up in the West End Park in Ottawa. When darkness falls, history of sorts will be made here. The Holland brothers of Ottawa, who among other things acted as agents for Mr. Thomas Edison, had decided to try out Mr. Edison's new Vitascope device, which projected moving pictures onto a screen. The Holland brothers were not too optimistic, but by 8 p.m. the seats were filled. The show opened with Belsaz the Magician, who performed some other tricks and then introduced the movies to Canada. They proved to be an unexpected hit. This was the feature of the evening, a movie called The Kiss, shown here in its entirety. For a while, the movies were just a part of a vaudeville show, but it soon became evident that you didn't need live entertainment. People would pay money just to see movies. So a barber shop in Calgary became the Palace Theatre. A dry goods store in Edmonton became the Bijou.
See, when movies started, people took little stores and they converted them. In the early days, they even, the theater owner didn't have enough money for seats, and he would borrow the seats from the undertaker down the road, down the street. And if there was a funeral, he was out of luck. He couldn't operate.
The early movies consisted mostly of scenery. Billy Bitzer, who went on to shoot Birth of a Nation, filmed the Fraser River Valley in 1899. The movie consisted of one shot taken from the front of a train. Royalty was another favorite subject. The Prince of Wales' visit to Quebec in 1903 played in theaters all over the world. A Toronto portrait photographer, George Scott, bought a movie camera and filmed one of the first on-the-spot newsreels, the Toronto Fire of 1904. Canadian companies sensed very early the potential of film. In 1902, the CPR hired this British company to make movies which would reassure potential immigrants that Canada indeed existed. They were under strict instruction to avoid any shots of ice or snow. But they obviously ignored this directive and made the Canadian winter seem like so much fun that the CPR decided to advertise it. This is the first hockey game ever filmed, a feature of the Montreal Winter Carnival of 1903. This is the old Toque Blue Snowshoe Club of Montreal, working up a thirst for the tavern on the other side of the mountain. The man being tossed in the air is the cameraman, Joseph Rosenthal. He was typical of the early Canadian filmmakers. They were either British or American, and came to Canada on assignment. The Great Northern and Grand Trunk Railways, seeing that the CPR had a good thing going, began to make movies for themselves. When Ernest Ouimet of Montreal filmed his children in 1908, Canada had its first home movie. Mr. Ouimet, with his general manager, Fred Howarth, was the first Canadian to construct a building expressly for the movies. His first Ouimetoscope went up in 1903, and by 1906, business was good enough for a larger theater. The second Ouimetoscope became Canada's first motion picture palace. With Edwin S. Porter's Great Train Robbery, made in 1903, the story film came into being, and the audience was no longer satisfied with the simple travelogue. The CPR continued to display a sophisticated understanding of the power of the new medium. The railway hired the Edison Stock Company of New York to make 10-minute dramatic films that would promote the glories of the Canadian West. Young Howard pleads for the hand of his beloved Mildred, but Howard is not well fixed financially. Mildred's father throws him out, and Howard heads west by CPR. He prospers in Saskatchewan. He meets a young widow on the broad main street of a new western town. But he continues to write to his beloved Mildred, little realizing that her father is intercepting his letters of love. The widow, in the meantime, forces her attentions on Howard over an irrigation ditch. But irrigation ditch or no irrigation ditch, Howard's heart is still in Montreal. Back in Montreal, Mildred reads a false report planted in the newspaper by her scheming father to the effect that Howard is about to be married to the widow. The father strikes before her tears are dry, ushering in a well-heeled suitor for his daughter's hand. Back in Saskatchewan, the selfless widow, now knowing of Howard's love for Mildred, gives up her designs on him and rushes east by CPR, carrying to Mildred the truth and a one-way CPR ticket to the Golden West. The Edison Company crossed the country on a special train, stopping off along the way to turn out 13 one-reel dramatic shorts. Miss Bennett of Toronto, a professional singer, records on an Edison phonograph. In British Columbia, a rough-hewn lumberjack is trying to decide how to spend all his money. The boys at the camp appreciate the phonograph. The lumberjack realizes the voice he is hearing is the voice of his childhood sweetheart, a fact which is made clear by this early example of the split screen and the flashback. Miss Bennett, in the meantime, receives a letter from a friend extolling the glories of the Canadian West. Arriving by CPR, it will not be long before she is reunited with her beloved lumberjack, who will soon become an immensely wealthy BC timber baron. At about the same time, American companies such as Kalem and Biograph were using the exotic Canadian bush as settings for straight commercial dramas that were not designed to push immigration. The villains were generally sex-crazed French-Canadian coureurs de bois. This film was directed by D.W. Griffith, who went on to better things. But most of the stories were American, and there was a growing resentment against them. In 1913, the Canadian Bioscope Company was set up in Halifax to shoot the first Canadian feature-length film, based on the Evangeline legend. The film made a lot of money, but all that remains of it are these few still photographs. Then it was 1914, and Canada was at war. Canadian cameramen were shooting newsreels and propaganda films to support the imperial war effort. The Americans were not yet in the war, and anti-American sentiment was running high. Film censorship was born, and the first things censored in Canada were scenes which featured the American flag. Canadian recruiting films were welcomed by theaters and governments until the troops actually went over to fight. By 1916, the Canadian Department of the Militia was demanding that newsreel footage from the Western Front be suppressed for fear it might discourage recruiting. Canadian nationalism was also being utilized by feature film producers. Movie studios were built during the war. The biggest was this one in Trenton, Ontario, the first attempt at a Hollywood of the North. 3 features were shot, the last one being The Great Shadow, made in 1919, starring Tyrone Power Sr. It was secretly sponsored by Canadian Pacific and capitalized on the almost pathological fear of communism prevalent at the time. CPR employees were marched off to see it at their lunch hour, but despite this captive audience, the studio folded. Then into this somewhat moribund scene came a blockbuster in the shape of 10% Ernie Shipman. He was born in Hull, Quebec, and he came back to Canada after a vigorous career in New York as a vaudeville promoter and all-round hustler. Ernie Shipman thought big, and he was going to put Canada in the movies. He brought to the task the flair of a great showman. To star in his first film, he brought one of his 5 wives, the beautiful and talented actress Nell Shipman from Victoria, BC. Nell rewrote a James Oliver Curwood story, while Ernie hustled some Calgary money for financing and handled the publicity. Back to God's Country was as close to a sensation as Canada would see. Nell, as the nature girl, is friendly with bears and beavers. The villain comes upon her and lusts after her body. Nell was to play this scene in a skin-tight leotard, but the leotard was wrinkled, so Nell threw it away and gave Canada its first skin flick. The villain, disguised as a Mountie, asks Nell's father for shelter and settles in for a little rape. The villain's sidekick gets his sidekicks. Nell's father hears his daughter's screams. The father accidentally kills the sidekick. The villain sees an opportunity to lose the old man. Nell dives to safety, but 8 reels later, she is still being pursued by the villain. Only these winter scenes were shot in Canada. The male romantic lead had to be replaced when he caught pneumonia and died in an Edmonton hospital. The rest of the film was shot in California. The real hero of the film, at any rate, was a dog. Back to God's Country returned 300% on its investment, and Ernie Shipman was very much in business. Next, he headed to Winnipeg to visit the Reverend Charles Gordon, who, writing under the name of Ralph Connor, was Canada's most popular novelist. Shipman had bought up some Connor stories and proceeded to produce 6 more feature films in the next 4 years. These films were all shot entirely in Canada, many of them directed by Henry McCrae, a former RCMP constable who had made it in Hollywood as a director of serials. Shipman set up separate companies in different Canadian cities for each film. The money was raised locally, and after each film was finished, Shipman would move on before the auditors arrived. Into Ottawa in 1923 came the Shipman entourage. The new leading lady was Pauline Garand, and the new movie would be The Man from Glengarry. Sets were built in the Central Canada Exhibition Grounds at Lansdowne Park, and the exteriors were shot in Ottawa and up the river at Mattawa. Man from Glengarry was a melodrama centered around 2 rival lumber gangs and the love life of an embattled heroine. The newly built Chateau Laurier Hotel was used for the opulent ballroom sequences, and the bright young things of Ottawa were thrilled to work for a day or two as a bit player, thus saving Ernie Shipman a little money. Like most of Shipman's films, The Man from Glengarry did reasonably well at the box office. But he came to grief shortly thereafter with a movie called Blue Water, shot in St. John, New Brunswick, and introducing Norma Shearer of Montreal. The picture foundered in mid-production, and Ernie Shipman quietly left town one night, leaving a few unpaid bills. He finished his movie in Florida, but it was a flop, and he was not seen again in Canada. Canada's most successful movie producer had used each organ of his body to its fullest extent. His liver was the first to go, and he was soon dead. The Canadian feature film industry virtually ceased to exist. Madeleine de Verchères, the only silent feature film made by a Quebec company, got little or no distribution, and nothing remains of it but these few still pictures. In Calgary, an aging Hollywood Western star, Neil Hart, slapped together a local company and filmed His Destiny in 1926. It was a hit in Calgary, but nowhere else, and the American promoters made off with the few dollars that it did take in. Films with Canadian themes were being done in Hollywood, with Hollywood companies. King Vidor shot the Ralph Connor story Sky Pilot in California and Idaho, with Colleen Moore as the little crippled girl. The Canadian, a Hollywood production